In 1973, inside the sprawling industrial corridors of Chicago, a corporate transaction quietly erased the soul of an American electronics giant. Rockwell International, a massive aerospace and technology conglomerate, purchased the Admiral Corporation. The acquisition was framed to the public and the press as a rescue, but on the factory floor, it operated like a demolition. Almost immediately, the new owners examined the profit margins, looked at the brutal reality of the American consumer electronics market, and decided that Admiral's core audio and television manufacturing was no longer worth the effort. The Chicago assembly lines that had once stamped out millions of Bakelite tabletop radios, the soldering stations that had wired the soundtrack of the American post-war middle class, and the engineering desks that had made the Admiral name a fixture on kitchen counters and bedroom nightstands were systematically dismantled. Within a few short years, the audio division was entirely gutted. The surviving scraps of the company, mostly its refrigerator and white goods appliance divisions, were stripped of their radio heritage and eventually sold off to Magic Chef. The paradox is that Admiral did not collapse because America stopped listening. It disappeared because the company that had built its empire by mastering the affordable American radio had allowed that empire to grow too large, too diverse, and too expensive to maintain domestically. A decade earlier, the Admiral badge on a tuning dial meant gritty, reliable Chicago engineering. By the end of the 1970s, it was just a licensed decal waiting to be slapped onto a washing machine. But the real story of Admiral Corporation is not only the story of a 1973 corporate buyout, it is the story of the American tabletop radio itself, how a Depression-era survival box built a Midwestern industrial mansion, how the pivot to General Appliances diluted a dedicated audio brand, and what happens when a radio empire chases scale until it forgets how to listen. Every week, we tell the stories of American radios, factories, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard the world, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Chicago in 1934. The story begins not with a sprawling factory, but with bankruptcy. Chicago in the 1930s was the undisputed capital of American radio manufacturing. It was a dense, loud industrial grid where component suppliers, metal stampers, wire winders, and cabinet makers operated in tight proximity. If a company wanted to build a radio quickly and cheaply, Chicago was the only place to do it. But the Great Depression had silenced many of those assembly lines. Ross Siragusa, a young Chicago entrepreneur born to a working-class immigrant family, had already built and lost his first empire. His previous venture, the Transformer Corporation of America, had grown into the largest manufacturer of radio-powered transformers in the world, before collapsing entirely under the weight of the 1930 economic crash. He was left with nothing but debt and a borrowed desk in the corner of a lawyer's office. Records indicate that Siragusa pawned his car and his family's furniture to scrape together exactly $3,400 in starting capital. With that modest sum, he founded the Continental Radio and Television Corporation in 1934. It was a desperate gamble at the worst possible time in American economic history. The major radio manufacturers, giants like RCA in Camden, Philco in Philadelphia, and Zenith right across town in Chicago, were fighting viciously over whatever disposable income the American public still had left. Those established empires commanded the high-end showrooms, selling massive polished mahogany console radios that cost as much as a used car. To survive, Siragusa knew he could not compete on luxury. He had to compete on volume, targeting the listeners that the massive corporations had overlooked. The American absence was clear. In the mid-1930s, the working-class American family did not need a luxury piece of musical furniture. They needed a lifeline. In rural America, where the Depression hit hardest, a radio was often the only connection to the outside world. The ability to pull a clear channel AM signal from Cincinnati or Nashville out of the night sky was not a luxury, it was a psychological necessity. The public needed a cheap, reliable box to hear President Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats, weather reports, and big band music to distract them from the grinding reality of the era. The market was starved for an affordable, for functioning tabletop radio that a factory worker or a farmer could actually buy without taking on crippling installment debt. Admiral understood that their product was a utilitarian bridge between the isolated listener and the national conversation. Siragusa's strategy was ruthless efficiency. Rather than building a massive assembly plant from scratch, Continental initially operated as a master assembler, buying components from the vast network of desperate Chicago electronic suppliers and having them built into small tabletop cabinets. The technological foundation that made this early survival possible was the widespread adoption of the 5-tube super heterodyne circuit. Known across the industry as the All-American 5, this was a brilliant, cost-effective radio circuit design that stripped away unnecessary complexity. Crucially, it eliminated the need for a heavy, expensive power transformer, ironically, the very component that had ruined Siragusa's first business. The All-American 5 circuit allowed the radio receiver to run safely and directly on standard household alternating or direct current. For the American listener, this engineering shortcut changed the physical relationship with the broadcast. The radio was no longer a heavy, stationary piece of living room architecture that required a complex external antenna or specialized battery packs. It became a compact, lightweight box. A mother in a Detroit suburb or a mechanic in a Cleveland garage could purchase a small Continental set, carry it home under one arm, and plug it directly into a kitchen or workshop wall outlet. They could catch the evening broadcast of local news or a comedy program over the clatter of dinner plates and tools. The radio had been demoted from a piece of fine furniture to a reliable household appliance, and in that demotion it found an entirely new, massive audience. But Continental Radio and Television Corporation was a cumbersome name. It lacked punch. Siragusa needed a brand identity that sounded authoritative, established, and distinctly American without implying a premium price tag. In 1936, he found his solution in the bankruptcy courts. For a mere $200, Siragusa purchased the rights to a defunct company's trademark, Admiral. That $200 purchase fundamentally changed the company's trajectory. The Admiral name sounded patriotic, commanding, and instantly trustworthy. Siragusa plastered the new Admiral badge on his inexpensive tabletop radios and pushed them aggressively into alternative retail channels. Instead of fighting for floor space in elite department stores, Admiral radios were shipped to Main Street hardware stores, local electronics shops, and regional catalog retailers. The strategy was to intercept working-class Americans exactly where they already shopped for hammers, vacuum cleaners, and household goods. By keeping the price point remarkably low, often under $15 for a basic AM receiver, Admiral moved staggering volume. The paradox of the Great Depression was that while luxury goods failed, affordable distraction thrived. By 1939, just 5 years after pawning his furniture, Siragusa's company was generating over $2 million in annual sales. Continental officially changed its name to Admiral Corporation to match its famous badge. The company was no longer just assembling parts from local vendors. It was establishing its own deafening, crowded factory floors in Chicago. The assembly lines became a blur of motion. Young men and women sat at long wooden benches under harsh industrial lighting. They wielded hot soldering irons, attaching resistors, capacitors, and glowing vacuum tubes to raw metal chassis. The smell of melting rosin flux and hot metal filled the air, a scent that defined the American electronics industry for decades. Every time a worker finished a chassis, it was slipped into a wooden box, tested for a clear AM signal, and boxed for shipping. Yet the problem was no longer basic survival. The new problem was the physical limitation of the radio cabinet itself. To build a traditional radio cabinet in the late 1930s required skilled carpenters, expensive wood veneers, toxic glues, meticulous sanding, varnishing, and extensive drying time. Wood was fundamentally slow, and in mass manufacturing, slowness meant expense. As labor costs in Chicago began to rise, Admiral's executives realized that the traditional method of building radios was cutting fatally into their razor-thin profit margins. If they wanted to truly dominate the American bedroom and kitchen counter, they could not rely on the lumber yard. That early success with the affordable wooden tabletop set did not solve the ultimate problem of the American radio market. It merely created a larger, hungrier industrial machine that now had to be fed. By the early 1940s, Admiral Corporation had successfully conquered the bottom of the American electronics market, but the company was colliding with a physical wall. The traditional wooden radio cabinet was fundamentally incompatible with high-speed mass production. Wood required curing, cutting, sanding, gluing, and varnishing. It required craftsmen. If Admiral wanted to put a radio in every room of the American home, they could not wait for glue to dry. The bottleneck was not the electronics. The bottleneck was the box. Then, history intervened, fundamentally rewiring American manufacturing. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the federal government immediately suspended all civilian radio production. The copper, steel, and electronic components previously used for living room entertainment were diverted to military communications. For many smaller radio assemblers in Chicago, the production freeze was a death sentence. For Admiral, it was the ultimate industrial education. Ross Siragusa aggressively pursued military contracts, transitioning his chaotic civilian assembly lines into highly disciplined defense manufacturing. Admiral began building sophisticated electronic equipment for the military, including specialized communication gear, radar components, and aircraft electronics. This wartime pivot taught the company two invaluable lessons. First, it taught them how to manage massive, relentless, government-level production scale. Second, it introduced them to the advanced synthetic materials that were quietly replacing wood and metal on the factory floor. When civilian production resumed in late 1945, Admiral did not return to the lumberyard. They turned to industrial chemistry. The breakthrough that transformed Admiral from a scrappy Chicago assembler into a towering electronics empire was the mastery of bakelite molding. Bakelite, an early, heat-resistant thermosetting plastic that could be molded into intricate, rigid shapes, was not entirely new to the radio industry, but Admiral weaponized it. Instead of relying on slow carpentry, Admiral invested heavily in massive hydraulic molding presses. A worker could pour raw phenolic resin powder into a heated steel mold, pull a heavy lever, and wait just a few minutes. When the press opened, a complete, flawless, highly stylized radio cabinet emerged, ready to be cooled and loaded with electronics. The process sliced through the manufacturing bottleneck, eliminated the carpenter, and changed the geometry of the American tabletop radio. These new bakelite cabinets were sleek, modern, and impervious to the scratches and water rings that ruined wooden consoles. More importantly, they were astonishingly cheap to produce at high volume. Admiral began stamping out millions of 5-tube AM receivers encased in deep brown, ivory, and ebony bakelite. To the American listener, this manufacturing shift changed the entire physical relationship with broadcasting. Before the war, a family typically owned one expensive radio, anchored in the living room like a heavy altar to network programming. Admiral's mass-produced bakelite sets, fractured that centralization. Priced as low as $14.95, the radio became a casual, decentralized household item. A returning GI could buy an Admiral tabletop radio for the bedroom. A suburban housewife could place a white Bakelite model on the Formica kitchen counter, its smooth plastic shell easily wiped clean of cooking grease. The radio was now small enough to sit on a garage workbench or a bathroom shelf. Inside these plastic shells glowed the vacuum tube, a glass electronic device that used a heated filament to control and amplify radio signals. These tubes generated considerable heat, a heat that the listener could physically feel radiating through the ventilation slots of the Bakelite cabinet. Operating an Admiral tabletop radio was a deeply tactile experience. The user gripped the tuning knob, physically turning the tuning capacitor, a component containing interlocking metal plates that changed the circuit's electrical capacity, to hunt for a specific frequency. Finding an AM signal required a delicate touch, turning the dial through bursts of static until the clear voice of a local newsman or the heavy bass of a rhythm and blues station locked into place. The radio felt alive, warm to the touch, humming with alternating current and Midwestern engineering. Admiral did not stop at the kitchen counter. Having mastered the rapid production of radio chassis and plastic cabinets, the company aimed at the middle-class living room with a new, highly aggressive product, the affordable radio phonograph console. A radio phonograph, a floor-standing cabinet that combined an AM/FM radio receiver with a mechanical record turntable, was previously a luxury item reserved for the wealthy. Admiral applied their brutal efficiency to this format, producing combination units that looked substantial, but were engineered to be assembled in minutes. To move this immense volume of electronics, Admiral bypassed the elitist department stores and targeted the exploding American suburbs. They flooded hardware stores, Main Street appliance dealers, and catalog showrooms with their products. A customer walking into a local electronics shop to buy a toaster or a vacuum cleaner would be confronted by a wall of Admiral radios, their bright gold tuning dials gleaming against dark plastic, promising instant access to the world for a fraction of the cost of a Zenith or an RCA. The strategy was devastatingly effective. By the late 1940s, Admiral was producing thousands of radios every single day. The Chicago assembly lines were deafening, a relentless mechanical rhythm of hydraulic presses slamming shut, pneumatic tools driving screws, and conveyor belts moving millions of vacuum tubes into millions of plastic sockets. The brand was no longer a desperate Depression-era startup. It was a juggernaut. But this explosive breakthrough carried a hidden structural danger. The efficiency of the hydraulic press and the speed of the assembly line meant that Admiral had built an industrial machine of terrifying proportions. A molding press only paid for itself if it never stopped running. A Chicago factory only remained profitable if it shipped thousands of units before sunset. The company had mastered the art of cheap, reliable audio, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves in a game of perpetual volume. The name on the tuning dial was no longer just a promise about AM reception. It was a badge of industrial scale, a scale that was about to demand far more fuel than tabletop radios alone could provide. By 1950, the Admiral Corporation was no longer a scrappy underdog fighting for retail survival. It was an industrial titan dictating the rhythm of the American consumer electronics market. The post-war economic boom had created a vast, newly affluent middle class with an insatiable appetite for household entertainment. Admiral fed this appetite with a manufacturing ecosystem that operated at a staggering scale. The company's flagship Cortlandt Street plant in Chicago functioned like a sovereign industrial city. Thousands of workers, operating in 3 deafening shifts, stamped raw metal chassis, molded tons of Bakelite resin, and began experimenting with printed circuit boards, a post-war technology that replaced hand-soldered wires with flat, copper-traced boards, further accelerating assembly speed. Admiral had also expanded its physical footprint aggressively, acquiring specialized cabinet-making facilities in Shelbyville, Indiana, and additional electronics plants in Harvard, Illinois, just to handle the massive overflow of consumer demand. In just over a decade, Ross Siragusa had turned a pawned desk and $3,400 into a corporation generating over $200 million in annual sales. By the early 1950s, Admiral was producing over 5 million radio receivers a year. But manufacturing scale meant nothing without a retail network that could absorb the relentless output. Admiral conquered the American retail landscape by infiltrating every possible avenue of sale. An American consumer did not have to visit a dedicated high-end audio showroom to buy an Admiral. Their distinct gold and white tuning dials gleamed from the mail-order catalog pages of Montgomery Ward. They were stacked high on the linoleum floors of thousands of independent Main Street appliance dealers across the Midwest. They sat prominently on the shelves of local hardware stores, placed efficiently next to power tools and vacuum cleaners. Admiral was no longer just selling a radio receiver. It was selling the soundtrack and the physical proof of the American middle-class ascent. To understand the peak of Admiral's power, one only has to look at the geography of the early 1950s American suburban home. The family might gather around a massive, polished wood Admiral radio phonograph console in the living room on a Sunday evening to listen to a syndicated CBS radio network broadcast. But the true dominance of the brand was found in its multiplication across the house. There was an Admiral clock radio on the bedroom nightstand, relying on standard alternating current to keep time and waking the father for his morning commute. There was a rugged 5-tube portable model sitting on the garage workbench, pulling in a local AM sports station over the noise of weekend carpentry. And most importantly, there was the pristine, white Bakelite Admiral sitting perfectly on the Formica kitchen counter, providing a reliable stream of weather reports, local news, and daytime serials to the American housewife. The listener trusted the Admiral badge because it represented a perfectly balanced industrial compromise. It was engineered well enough to pull a clean, selective AM signal out of the atmospheric static, and it was priced low enough that a factory worker could purchase a second or third set for the house without taking on installment debt. However, that exact strength would soon become the trap. The distribution network Admiral had built, the thousands of local dealers, the massive catalog contracts, the sprawling Midwestern factory floors, had grown so large and so efficient that tabletop radios alone could no longer generate enough margin to sustain the machine. A tabletop AM radio was ultimately a low-profit item. Once an American family bought 3 or 4 radios to fill their rooms, they did not need another one for a decade. To keep the Cortlandt Street presses roaring and the Main Street dealers loyal, the Chicago Empire realized it had to find something bigger, more expensive, and far more complex to build. The pivot required to feed the Cortlandt Street machine changed the fundamental DNA of the Admiral Corporation. To maintain the breathtaking volume of their Chicago manufacturing ecosystem, Ross Siragusa realized the company had to evolve beyond tabletop audio. A $15 Bakelite AM radio could capture a customer's loyalty, but it could not sustain a rapidly expanding corporate empire with thousands of unionized employees. Admiral needed products with significantly higher retail margins. They found their answer in the television set and the kitchen appliance. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Admiral aggressively entered the television market, utilizing the exact same strategy that had made their radios ubiquitous: extreme mass production and ruthless pricing. They produced massive wood-veneered consoles that combined a television screen, an AM/FM radio receiver, and a mechanical phonograph into one gigantic piece of living room furniture. To the American family moving into a newly built suburban tract home, this was the ultimate entertainment center. Admiral's production lines were soon churning out televisions at a pace that rivaled established giants like RCA and Zenith. But the most fateful decision came when Admiral expanded into white goods, the industry term for large domestic appliances like refrigerators, freezers, and electric ranges. Siragusa acquired the dual-temp refrigerator line, retrofitting his vast manufacturing networks to stamp heavy steel and pump refrigerant, rather than wind-tuning coils and solder radio chassis. For a brief, shining moment in the 1950s, this massive diversification worked flawlessly. Admiral became a towering monolith of American consumerism. Their neon signs illuminated the Chicago skyline. They sponsored national network television broadcasts, beaming their logo into the very living rooms they had just furnished. A loyal consumer could wake up to an Admiral clock radio, pull milk from an Admiral refrigerator, listen to a baseball game on an Admiral portable radio in the backyard, and end the evening watching an Admiral television. The brand had achieved total domestic saturation. The Admiral badge did not merely guarantee a clear AM signal or cold milk. It guaranteed a uniquely American promise that premium domestic engineering could be mass-produced for the working-class paycheck. At its absolute peak, Admiral employed over 8,000 unionized workers across its Midwestern facilities. The factory floors in Chicago and Harvard, Illinois, were a testament to American industrial might, a choreographed chaos of forklifts, heavy steel presses, and relentless assembly lines operating around the clock. Train cars full of raw copper, glass tubes, and plastic resin rolled into the loading docks every morning. And fleets of delivery trucks rolled out every evening, packed with finished electronics destined for Main Street America. The company had built a self-sustaining ecosystem where local Midwestern labor fed local American retail. Yet beneath this staggering scale, a quiet and fatal shift was occurring. By transforming from a dedicated radio manufacturer into a general appliance conglomerate, Admiral was diluting its original identity. The radio, the foundational product that had built the company, the device that required precision tuning and audio engineering, was slowly demoted. In the Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs, Admiral radios were pushed to the back pages, overshadowed by high-margin refrigerators and heavy air conditioners. The engineering focus shifted. The meticulous attention once paid to the selectivity of a superheterodyne circuit, the radio's ability to cleanly separate competing AM signals in a crowded broadcast market, was redirected toward designing better ice makers and frost-free freezers. The radio became an afterthought, a low-priority item manufactured out of corporate habit rather than acoustic passion. The Chicago giant had successfully conquered every room in the American home. But in its relentless pursuit of scale, Admiral had built an industrial machine so bloated, so heavily reliant on expensive domestic labor, and so distracted by home appliances, that it was entirely unprepared for the economic shockwaves gathering just across the Pacific. The collapse of the American radio manufacturing empire did not begin with a sudden bankruptcy or a dramatic factory fire. It began quietly, on a corporate ledger, as a problem of simple mathematics. By the early 1960s, the Admiral Corporation found itself colliding with the first major structural force of the American broadcast market, the inescapable reality of domestic cabinet, tube, component, and labor costs. The sprawling Cortlandt Street plant in Chicago and the massive assembly lines in Harvard, Illinois, had been built for a specific era of manufacturing. They were designed around the vacuum tube, heavy metal chassis, and massive bakelite molding presses. This infrastructure required thousands of skilled, unionized American workers to operate. As wages, benefits, and raw material costs rose throughout the decade, the profit margin on a standard tabletop AM radio began to evaporate. A radio could still tune beautifully, picking up a clear channel signal from hundreds of miles away, and still lose money the moment it left the loading dock. Simultaneously, Admiral was hit by the fourth major market force, the unrelenting wave of imports and good enough listening. Across the Pacific, Japanese manufacturers like Sony and Panasonic were aggressively pushing into the American market, armed with a technology that rendered Admiral's massive Midwestern infrastructure obsolete: the transistor. A transistor? A tiny solid-state electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with far less heat, space, and power than a traditional glass vacuum tube, changed the physical reality of the radio. It did not require a heavy power transformer. It did not require a massive, heat-resistant bakelite cabinet. It could run on small batteries. For the American listener, the transistor severed the radio from the wall outlet. A teenager no longer had to sit in the living room or the kitchen to hear the latest Top 40 broadcast. They could carry a cheap, imported pocket radio to the beach, the park, or the high school bleachers. Admiral attempted to adapt, shifting towards solid-state engineering and utilizing printed circuit boards, flat boards carrying electronic components, and copper tracks that eliminated the need for slow, manual wire soldering. But producing a small, cheap transistor radio using expensive Chicago labor simply did not make economic sense. When a customer walked into a local Main Street electronics store in 1965, they saw American-made Admiral radios sitting next to imported Japanese models that were smaller, lighter, and significantly cheaper. The consumer, realizing that the imported set was perfectly adequate for listening to the morning weather or a local baseball game, consistently chose the cheaper option. To survive this brutal margin compression, Ross Siragusa and his executive board made an irreversible decision. In 1967, they established the Admiral Overseas Corporation, or AOC, in Taipei, Taiwan. This was the first fatal crack in the foundation of the empire. Initially, the Taiwanese facility was justified to the press and the workers as a supplemental operation. AOC was established to manufacture basic, labor-intensive components and sub-assemblies, such as tuning coils and wiring harnesses, which would then be shipped back to Chicago for final assembly. But an offshore supply chain is a relentless mechanism. Once a company realizes it can manufacture a printed circuit board for a fraction of the cost overseas, it soon realizes it can manufacture the entire radio chassis there. Within a few years, the dynamic on the Chicago factory floors shifted. The deafening roar of the metal stamping presses and the organized chaos of the soldering stations began to quiet down. Veteran line workers, who had spent decades building the soundtrack of the American post-war boom, found themselves uncrating finished electronics arriving in shipping containers from across the Pacific. The company that had built its name on gritty Midwestern engineering was quietly admitting that American electronics manufacturing was no longer viable for low-cost audio. Furthermore, Admiral was falling victim to the fifth market force: a profound technological and listening culture shift. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the American radio audience was migrating toward the FM dial. FM stereo, broadcasting that carried discrete left and right audio channels over a frequency-modulated signal, offered a wider, cleaner, and far more immersive acoustic experience. This shift demanded high-fidelity stereo receivers, precise tuners, and sophisticated acoustic engineering. But Admiral had diluted its audio soul. The company was now deeply entrenched in the white goods appliance business, pouring its research and development budgets into designing better refrigerators, electric ranges, and heavy-color televisions. They treated the radio not as a precision acoustic instrument, but as a low-priority legacy appliance. While specialized hi-fi companies like Marantz, Macintosh, and Pioneer were capturing the new FM stereo market, Admiral was relying on the fading momentum of its name to sell basic, outdated tabletop sets. By the turn of the 1970s, the Admiral badge still carried the weight of history, but the Chicago factories behind it were structurally hollowing out, leaving a bloated, unfocused appliance corporation perfectly positioned for a corporate predator to step in. In 1973, the Admiral Corporation finally surrendered its independence, triggering the ultimate collapse of its Chicago empire. The buyer was Rockwell International, a massive aerospace and Appliance industrial conglomerate. Rockwell built military aircraft, spacecraft components, and complex industrial machinery for the federal government. They purchased the sprawling Admiral empire for approximately $75 million. The acquisition was driven by a specific, arrogant corporate theory. Rockwell's executives believed they could take their advanced, military-grade microelectronics and seamlessly integrate them into Admiral's consumer products, specifically color televisions and home appliances. They assumed that superior aerospace engineering would automatically translate into dominance on the Main Street retail shelf. But that assumption was a fatal miscalculation. Government contracting and consumer electronics operate in two entirely different, deeply hostile realities. An aerospace company, accustomed to massive federal budgets and cost-plus contracts, simply did not understand the brutal, razor-thin profit margins of selling a toaster, a refrigerator, or a tabletop radio to an American housewife. When Rockwell's financial auditors arrived at the Cortlandt Street headquarters, they confronted the cold mathematics of the American consumer electronics market. The radio division, the foundational core that Ross Siragusa had built from a pawned desk during the Great Depression, was effectively dead weight on the corporate ledger. The American market was completely saturated with cheap, efficient, solid-state receivers from overseas. An American-made tabletop AM/FM radio, assembled by unionized labor in the Midwest, could no longer compete on a Montgomery Ward catalog page against a Taiwanese unit that cost half as much and performed just as well. The American consumer, standing at a retail counter, had already voted with their wallet. They no longer cared about Chicago manufacturing heritage. They cared about the retail price tag. Rockwell was a company of spreadsheets, not acoustic nostalgia. They possessed zero sentimental attachment to the warm, physical glow of a vacuum tube, or the heavy tactile resistance of a Bakelite tuning dial. The aerospace executives immediately initiated a massive clinical restructuring to stop the financial bleeding. They began to systematically strip away the unprofitable divisions, desperately trying to save the television and white goods appliance lines. The dedicated radio assembly lines were the very first to face the corporate axe. The sprawling Midwestern facilities that had once stamped out millions of tabletop receivers were shuttered, sold off, or completely gutted to make room for generic appliance manufacturing. The highly specialized engineering teams that had designed accessible, reliable superheterodyne circuits for the American working class were permanently dissolved. Thousands of line workers, who had spent decades mastering the rhythm of the soldering iron and the hydraulic molding press, were handed severance checks and sent out into a rapidly deindustrializing Chicago. Furthermore, Admiral was fundamentally incapable of competing in the new high-fidelity landscape of the late 1970s. The American listening culture had shifted dramatically toward the FM dial. The rise of FM stereo, combined with the explosion of album-oriented rock formats, demanded sophisticated, high-performance stereo receivers. A listener did not want a single tabletop box anymore. They wanted a modular component system with a dedicated tuner, a heavy amplifier, and massive wooden floor speakers. Companies like Marantz, Pioneer, and Macintosh were building brushed aluminum receivers that looked like scientific instruments and sounded like concert halls. Admiral could not pivot to this high-end market because they had spent the previous 20 years optimizing for the cheapest possible kitchen radio and the largest possible refrigerator. The aerospace executives at Rockwell had no interest in investing millions of dollars into acoustic research to build a hi-fi stereo receiver that could compete with the Japanese imports. The gap between what the American FM listener demanded and what the Admiral factories were equipped to build had become an unbridgeable chasm. The brand was trapped in the past, entirely associated with a mono AM tabletop experience that younger generations were rapidly abandoning. By the mid-1970s, the Admiral name ceased to represent Midwestern audio engineering. It was reduced to a hollow mechanism of badge engineering. Badge engineering is a deceptive corporate practice where a famous, historically trusted brand name is simply licensed and applied to generic, outsourced products to trick the consumer into trusting the purchase. An American listener walking into a local hardware store might still see a small, cheap plastic radio bearing the Admiral logo on the shelf. But the device inside that plastic case contained zero Chicago heritage. It was entirely manufactured by anonymous offshore contractors, mechanically identical to a dozen other cheap imports, wearing the Admiral badge like a stolen uniform. The local electronics dealers felt the betrayal first. A Main Street shop owner, who had proudly stocked Admiral televisions and radios since the 1950s, suddenly found themselves unboxing products that lacked the durability and the acoustic warmth of the original units. The service networks, the local repairmen who knew the schematics of an Admiral chassis by heart, realized these new, imported plastic radios were not designed to be fixed. When a cheap printed circuit board failed, the radio was not carried to a repair bench. It was simply thrown in the trash. The era of the repairable American radio was officially over. The physical dismantling of the Chicago Empire was a devastating blow to the local economy. The Cortlandt Street plant had been more than just a factory. It was a micro-city that supported entire neighborhoods. When Rockwell began liquidating the manufacturing assets, they were not just selling off steel presses and wire winders. They were dismantling a massive supply chain of local vendors, box makers, and component suppliers that had relied on Admiral's massive volume to survive. The ecosystem that had made Chicago the undisputed radio capital of the world was fracturing irreparably. Even the drastic pivot to refrigerators and televisions could not save the American manufacturing base. Rockwell quickly realized that the entire consumer electronics sector was a massive, unmanageable drain on their aerospace profits. They could not compete with the rising dominance of Sony, Panasonic, and a wave of aggressive domestic appliance consolidators. In 1979, just 6 years after buying the industrial empire, Rockwell abandoned the consumer market entirely in a humiliating retreat. They sold the remaining scraps of the Admiral Appliance division to Magic Chef, a company known primarily for building kitchen stoves. Magic Chef was an appliance company. They had zero interest in resurrecting a dead radio line. The Admiral name was strictly relegated to washers, dryers, and freezers. The transition was absolute. A brand that had proudly connected rural farmers to presidential addresses and teenagers to the first crackle of rock and roll over an AM signal was now entirely defined by how well it could freeze meat. The original promise between the radio dial and the listener had been officially erased. The enormous Midwestern industrial machine that had put a voice in every American room was systematically dismantled until nothing remained but the concrete footprint of the factories. The Cortlandt Street line stopped. The heavy hydraulic presses went cold. The local Main Street dealers moved on. The Union Electronics jobs vanished. The acoustic engineering division died. The famous corporate badge was sold. The Chicago factories went dark. The broadcast signal was lost, but the old radios survived. The ultimate fate of the Admiral Corporation is a textbook example of corporate brand dilution. After the aerospace conglomerate Rockwell International sold the remaining appliance assets to Magic Chef in 1979, the Admiral name entered a long, slow drift through the American corporate landscape. Magic Chef was subsequently absorbed by Maytag in 1986, and Maytag was eventually swallowed by the Whirlpool Corporation in 2006. With each successive merger, the original Midwestern identity of the brand was further erased, moving further and further away from the radio dial. Today, the Admiral name still exists in the American retail market, but it operates exclusively as a ghost. The Whirlpool Corporation licenses the Admiral trademark to the Home Depot, applying the badge to a budget-priced line of washing machines and electric dryers. A consumer walking down a brightly lit aisle in a modern big-box hardware store might see the Admiral logo printed on a plastic control panel. But that badge carries zero acoustic heritage. It has been completely severed from the vacuum tube, the tuning dial, and the deafening Chicago assembly lines that originally gave it meaning. The empire that Ross Siragusa built from a pawned desk to dominate the American airwaves is now just a decal on a washing machine. Yet, outside the corporate ledgers, a profound physical resurrection is occurring. In the vibrant American preservation community, the original Admiral radio sets refuse to die. Across the country, at local hamfests, in the crowded aisles of antique radio shows, on dedicated vintage radio forums, and in the digital auction listings of eBay, Admiral tabletop radios from the 1940s and 1950s remain highly prized artifacts. This subculture of amateur engineers, tube suppliers, and audio historians does not treat these receivers as static museum pieces. They treat them as functional machines. On wooden repair benches in garages from Pennsylvania to California, restorers are carefully bringing Admiral sets back to life. They use modern digital multimeters to trace analog circuits that were drawn up before television was commonplace. They heat up soldering irons to replace dried-out wax paper capacitors, electronic components that store and release energy, which inevitably degrade over decades. They source vintage vacuum tubes to replace burned-out glass filaments. They meticulously polish the heavy bakelite cabinets, stripping away decades of kitchen grease and cigarette smoke to reveal the original deep, glossy shine. The original Admiral radio still matters today because it passes the ultimate test of industrial design. It remains fully repairable. Unlike the cheap, imported solid-state radios of the 1970s, or the disposable smart speakers of the modern era, a 1950 Admiral All-American 5 tabletop radio was built with an open, accessible metal chassis. A skilled technician with a schematic and a soldering iron can diagnose a fault, replace a single 50-cent resistor, and restore the radio to perfect working order. The object was not designed for a landfill. It was designed for a lifespan. Furthermore, the radio still performs its fundamental duty. When fully restored, an Admiral Bakelite AM receiver can still pull a clear channel broadcast out of the night sky. The tuning capacitor still requires a human hand to manually hunt for the signal, listening through bursts of atmospheric static to lock onto a distant voice. The warm, distinct hum of the vacuum tubes still fills the room with a physical presence that modern digital audio cannot replicate. It remains a tactile, glowing piece of functional history. The physical sites of that history, however, have largely vanished. The sprawling Cortlandt Street plant in Chicago, which once employed thousands of unionized workers and stamped out millions of plastic cabinets, has long since been demolished and silenced. Like much of the heavy industrial infrastructure of the Midwestern Rust Belt, the footprint of the Admiral Empire was erased, replaced by commercial zoning and the quiet reality of a de-industrialized city. The local Main Street electronics stores that once stacked Admiral radios to the ceiling are now empty storefronts or coffee shops. There is a profound, surprising footnote to the collapse of this radio giant. Rockwell International, the massive aerospace conglomerate that coldly dismantled Admiral's audio division in the 1970s because it lacked profit margin, eventually suffered its own corporate demise. Over the ensuing decades, Rockwell was broken apart. Its various aerospace and industrial divisions sold off to other corporations until the conglomerate effectively ceased to exist. The billion-dollar corporate predator was erased from the market, but the $15 Bakelite radios that Rockwell threw away outlasted them. The history of the Admiral Corporation demonstrates the unforgiving nature of the American broadcast and electronics market. The market rewards scale, but it relentlessly punishes distraction. Admiral built a towering industrial mansion by mastering the affordable tabletop receiver, turning radio broadcasting into an accessible, multi-room utility for the working class. But when the company valued sheer manufacturing volume over its core acoustic identity, it dismantled the very foundation of trust that had made it essential. The evidence suggests that a brand can successfully conquer every room in the American home, yet disappear completely the moment it forgets how to listen. Somewhere on a basement workbench in Illinois, a dark brown Bakelite Admiral radio sits plugged into a wall outlet, its glass vacuum tubes glowing warm orange in the dim light, waiting for a hand to turn the dial and find a voice in the static. See you in the next one.